Hello and welcome back. I hope you had a good break. I hope you enjoyed your coffee, your tea, your wee, whatever you did. I hope you enjoyed it. Can the other panelists come back on? That would be fantastic. Thank you. Brilliant to see you. Look at that. We have an embarrassment of talent lined up for this next session. And you've seen everyone talk already. And it's a really interesting area. We've got about 3 or 4 different slices of action here, all of which fill me with real interest. Now, you maybe not know who I am, so I'll explain who I am. My name's Mark Shayler. I'm one of the directors of Springfield Agri. And I've got a history. I've been working for 32 years. I'm 52 years old, granddad, father, smallholder, all of the things that you'd expect. I learned permaculture 30 years ago. And I appreciate the indigenous roots of this movement that we're currently sat in. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. I was also the head of sustainability at ASDA for a period. So I know FareShare really, really well. I've been working in data and animal rearing, actually. So I link in with Envision. I've got a real soft spot for the work that Holly's doing. It's absolutely incredible. And David just talks common sense. So the whole thing kind of makes sense to me. So we've got some really interesting questions that have come in. And if you've got more questions, feel free to pop them into the box and they will be magically sent to me. But I'm going to start with you, David, if I may. We've got a really simple and basic question, but I think people need to understand more about waste. And the question was, how does a MRF, how does a materials recovery facility actually work?
Thanks, Mark. When you collect your waste at home or in a business, you may put them into your glass, your aluminium, or your paper, or your plastics into one bin rather than separating them out. And many councils do these commingled collections. So if at the end you want to get, plastics into plastics recycling or aluminium into aluminium recycling, you have to sort them out. And this is what a materials recovery facility does. Essentially, the waste comes in, it gets dumped off a truck, it goes through all these conveyor belts, and bingo, magic, at the end of them, you get a pile of plastic, a pile of glass, a pile of aluminium, a pile of paper, and such like. The problem with this, with doing it this way, of course, is you get a lot of cross-contamination. And if you want to get clean waste streams, then really you want to have separate collection at source. And use the MRFs for what you really can't source segregate.
That's interesting. So what is the difference in yield? Let's say a ton of material coming in through source segregated and a ton of material coming into the MRF. How much is lost in the source segregated versus the MRF? How much more effective is the former?
Listen, I haven't got a percentage figure for you. I would estimate that probably source segregated would possibly give you between a quarter and a third better yields.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. And that then flips me to another question for you, Shula, actually. So I'm really interested in the reason that food ends up out of spec or thrown away. And I've worked within the supermarket industry. Trust me, I was there for under 15 months. It was either me or them that went, and it wasn't going to be them, was it? But I appreciate their role in society. I'm really interested in how we can push back on the specifications, the crazy specifications that we see within some buying teams, where apples are like too big. And you just think, how can an apple be too big? How do we challenge and change that? And if we do, Shula, will that damage what FareShare does, or would you welcome that?
I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg question. I have to say, when I joined FareShare 5 years ago, as part of the FareShare Go team, where we arranged charities to collect direct from the supermarket, that was kind of one of my first questions. And it's a really difficult one because the retailers will often say it's customers, and the customers will say, we don't care. So I'm going to be very honest, we haven't got to the bottom of it, and neither have our retailers. But I do think that work is being done. So you'll see in Tesco's, they now have the perfectly imperfectly range, perfectly imperfect range. Morrison's do their wonky veg boxes as well. And these are kind of a lower price point as well. So it is being tackled, but it's a slow work, I think. And in terms of how that affects FareShare, we receive surplus for lots of different reasons, and the kind of retailer spec is just one of those. But it does have a big impact. I've been direct onto farms and seen the spec sheets that they have to build by and the different sizes and things like that. And we use that information in FareShare to almost build a FareShare spec. So that they will show me a picture of what a retailer can't take, and we can say, yes, we take that. Now, FareShare exists to reduce food waste. So if there's any way that we can reduce that food waste, that's what we're going to be there to do. And if it goes down, that's all for the good. So we don't have, you know, a negative feeling about reducing that food waste from, you know, kind of lowering specs and things like that. I think work has been done, but it is, as I said before, it's that chicken and egg scenario, and who is putting those boundaries into specs is still a bit unanswered, I'm afraid.
I know, I hear that. And I sat in between the horns of that dilemma. And I mean, I've got my own view on that situation, okay? And, but we're not going to get an agreement on it. So we have to, I guess we just have to work together. And that brings me on to you, Mark. It's really interesting. I very much enjoyed your presentation. I mean, data is everything, but insight makes data better. That data can be seen everywhere, and it's incredible, and it's enriching, and it helps us make better decisions. And the fascinating thing is, one of the stats I read is only 1% of agricultural research is actually farmer led. The rest is actually big pharma led or chemical company led. How can we use your data to enable farmers to lead and develop research that will help them?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and it comes back to, I guess, you know, government policy and, you know, where we're going in the world of levelling up and build back greener and all of the sort of recovery things that are coming out of the government at the moment. And, you know, interestingly, you should say this, but just a couple of days ago, I saw DEFRA and UK Research and Innovation committing to something like £11 million, £12 million actually, on early stage innovation to tackle farming challenges that might lead to further R&D and industrial research for high potential solutions. So 2 pots of money, 5 million and 7 million, that they are essentially looking to develop new ways to use that data to solve challenges that exist within the farming. And I think, you know, by taking platforms that have been proven in other areas that may be adjacent and using that money wisely, you know, on real problems that people have, could be quite a good way of doing that. And then over time, you know, lobbying, as we, you know, always will have done, you know, governments and so on and so forth, you know, I'd expect we can start to see some kind of shift, you know, because as I sort of pointed out, it's a large portion of Britain's land is farmland. So, you know, I think over time, they'll start to be a move to that, but it's interesting to see that small seed of, you know, it's a small amount of money, 12 million for innovation, but it's just one of the things I've seen recently, you know, compared to other industries.
Totally. And yeah, Elon Musk then pops up with $100 million to fund new ways of capturing carbon. And Charles Ross has asked, he notes that, and he says, why aren't we just using current methods to capture and trap carbon? And so my follow-on question to you, Mark, is how can we measure successful carbon entrapment within soil, and how can that then be monetized so that the farmer can be paid for farming carbon or for refarming carbon rather than anything else?
Yeah, and I think this is all interrelated, to be honest, because at the minute there is no, excuse me, at the minute we manage money, right, in financial systems, but there is no real way to manage carbon in a similar way, to the similar level of management and rigor that we give to money. So managing end-to-end carbon value chains is really important, and the ability to get those soil samples, understand, you know, what's within them, how it's changed, the impact of things over time, it is also really important. And I think, you know, getting data is one challenge, the IoT part of the solution, to get the data, and then like the hands, if you like, and then the brains, the AI side, is what you do with that data to drive meaning from it. And essentially, all of this is interrelated, from energy production to waste to soil conditions, and it needs to be tracked end to end. Just as has been outlined globally with scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for all businesses. This is a complete value chain that I think needs to be treated with the same rigor that cash is treated with in terms of carbon. And I think we'll see technical developments, software developments of that over time. But the ability to get soil data is within our grasp, and do things with it is perfectly achievable with what we have today.
Brilliant, thank you. And Holly, that brings me straight into you, actually, because you at one end you've got this incredible, sophisticated data collection machine, some huge algorithms that sit behind that, and at the other scale, you've got people on allotments, small holdings, and gardens. What can they do? Well, number one, how can they use data if they can? And number two, most practically, what can they do, Holly? How can we help people at that end? How can we advise them?
Well, I guess it's establishing a diverse planting system as much as possible, like farmers need to move towards. So, and also keeping living roots in the soil to feed the microbiology. So perennials, edible perennials, are a really good thing that allotments or gardeners can put in, because obviously you're not pulling up the microbes with it. The roots are staying in. It's all about managing and feeding your microbiology, because if your whole system's working well, you're capturing more carbon as well. Obviously, to have a really good compost pile as well. And it's a real art form. I never realized till recently how complicated it is, but if you can make a compost that has all this microbiology in it, and then put it in, and then have your plant roots in there all the time, that's really the key to both farming and small scale. And if we can grow as much food locally as possible, and engage people along the journey, so the kids learning, so they own these new beautiful orchards that are being planted everywhere, so that they respect the food that they're eating, so they're not wasting it so much. But we don't really have time for all the kids to come through. We've got to do most of the work now. So yeah, just growing food and trying to do it in a way that uses no chemicals, obviously, and don't dig your soil as much. There's ways of planting and changing just grass without having to dig it all up, and it's all online.
The internet solves these problems. I love that, Holly. I'm going to come back to you with another question in a minute, but I want to go back up to David, really. So David, we've had a couple of questions around this. What infrastructure is required to create a national composting program that can then support regenerative agriculture? In my local authority, I mean, I've written waste strategies for local authorities all across the Midlands, and they're so variable from one borough to another, let alone from one county to another. How do we begin to solve this problem and create a national compost collection infrastructure, and then tie that into regenerative agriculture?
Okay, well, the good news is that there are lots of compost and anaerobic digestion plants across the whole of the UK. I guess somewhere in the region of 250 compost plants, and somewhere in the region of about 100 AD plants taking food waste from households and businesses every day of the week. So that treatment infrastructure is there. What is missing, of course, is the collections, the household collections. But the good news here, again, is that from the end of 2023, every council, when they renew their collection contracts, will be obliged to offer source segregated food waste collections to every house and to every small business. The question then becomes, as I said in my presentation, about the quality and how you do this and how much you do intercept. And currently we already have obligatory food waste collections in Wales and in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and certainly Scotland and Northern Ireland are intercepting very, very small amounts of food waste. And so it's a question of how you do it, as much as making the obligation there in legal terms.
That's really interesting, and that whole issue of 2023 being a deadline that's going to change the offer to the individual, but that's going to be some of those authorities are going to be charging for that service, I'm guessing.
Listen, we don't have a system in the UK where we charge for our collections. We pay it through the council tax, don't we? And the government has said that food waste collections to households will be financed from central government to councils.
Okay, so if I want an extra compost bin, I have to pay for that at the moment.
No, if you want a compost bin for your garden, that's your business. But if you want a little caddy in your kitchen and a bag to take that into collection on the street, the council will presumably provide that to you for free. The question which councils don't understand is that they see the costs of setting this up, but they don't see the savings from running it. Now, every tonne of food waste that you take to a compost or an AD plant at £50 a tonne, you're not taking to an incinerator at £120 a tonne. Okay, so there are huge savings. And as you saw from my presentation, the data from Italy shows that the highest recycling levels are where you have the highest interception of food waste. And those same areas are with the lowest individual household costs for waste management.
And that is a great argument for unitary authorities for the waste disposal and the waste collection to be bundled together, because otherwise one's getting the benefit and the other one's getting the cost.
Yeah, I've never quite understood this dichotomy that we have in Britain, why we've done that. And of course, it creates more confusion than it does benefits. But essentially, we have to have consistency across our waste management system. The government recognises this. I'm on the DEFRA advisory board helping to understand this. And hopefully by 2023, we'll have the laws in place, which will mean that if you go from Devon to Somerset or Somerset to Surrey, you will generally be able to recognise the way in which waste is collected from one to the other. Today, you can't.
From one side of the street to another in some areas. Thank you, David. Great answer. And Shula, so, I mean, I've been working with you guys for a long, 25 years. I've been working with FareShare, spoken at your events, really, really love what you do. But your existence is a structural failure. The very fact that you have to exist is a massive failure in society. Should it be the responsibility of government or charity to provide 3 million meals a week for people who can't afford them?
Well, I think FareShare, firstly, when we were first kind of came into existence, we were there to tackle the food waste problem first. That's why we started. And the fact that we then use that food to divert it to people that are in need and that are vulnerable is just the outlet that we use. There are other organisations that also deal with surplus food and food waste, like Olio, and that's for any member of the public. So it's not FareShare's responsibility to feed these people. But however, what we're doing is we're taking a problem, which is the food waste, and we're diverting it to the people that we think are most in need. And that's across the community. And whilst we're providing those millions and millions of meals, it's also with those charities outside of a pandemic, obviously, it's about people being able to sit down together. Most of the organisations that we work with and we divert food to actually tackle a lot of other problems other than just the hunger part. And they're about a community and they're about signposting and, like supported housing. It's there for people so they can live their lives. But a day centre for the elderly isn't so much about essentially the food poverty. It's about community and tackling loneliness. So I think, the problem of food waste has existed and that's why we exist. But the way that we divert it, it doesn't necessarily make that our problem, but we help to try and be part of the solution.
Brilliant. I love that answer. Thank you. Thank you very much. And look, there are many ways to solve this problem of poverty and food, and linking them back to regenerative agriculture. One of them is to redistribute what's being wasted. The other one, Mark, is to actually be able to grow more in the same acreage, in the same hectareage. Can we use your technology to measure soil health? And how can your average farmer, how can she or he get involved in that kind of appropriate use of your tech?
Yeah, I mean, without doubt, the technology we have could be used to manage and measure soil health I think some of the good ways to get involved in that could be through some of these innovation projects I mentioned earlier that UKRI and DEFRA are promoting. So I'd be really interested to hear from anybody that is interested in that, and happy to share some links about that have been published as well. And it's really through conversation and bringing the science that and the knowledge that the community here have with, and combining that with the tech knowledge and how we can use it better. I mean, it's really interesting to me that if you took globally less than 1% of agricultural land and converted it to solar panels, it'd be enough for our global electricity demand. And that's really because, where we often put solar panels, or historically have put solar panels, have been in deserts. The conditions are just too harsh. Yes, it's really sunny, but there's lots of other impacts. I mean, an old adage would be, for farming, that, agriculture can overproduce anything. 8,000 years ago, farmers found the best places in the world to harvest solar panels, solar energy from solar panels. And that doesn't come. Yes, there's a bit of a look about that. A look of solar panels might look very different to a look of crops. But there's also been some research done that have shown some DEFRA funded research, some UK European research done that then look at the impact on soil and finding positive impacts, because the soil is cooler because of the shielding from the solar panels. So the gaps between them were a lot hotter, but the area below it. And these solar panels, don't last forever. They have a electrical lifetime, so they have to be given up at some time, normally 25 years.
That's brilliant. And you've actually answered another question that had already slipped in there. So we got 2 for 1 then. I really appreciate that. And then coming down to another scale, once more, Holly, I'm a consumer, or I like to call them a human, sat at home. How can I get involved in stimulating and supporting regenerative agriculture? What can I do practically to engage in this debate and to actually support farmers doing good things?
Well, it's a bit tricky at the moment because there's no labelling system that covers it. I understand that the Soil Association in talks with others about creating a regenerative organic label that they have over in America. But at the moment, all you can do is go for the best you can afford and realize that food is going to be so much better, not only for the environment, but also for your health. I've done quite a lot of research on the health side of it. And basically, we're having to eat loads more than what we should do, because our food has lost so many nutrients because of the way we farm. And there's no finger pointing here. It's just happened. So we've got to bounce back. So you need to look for organic, obviously, because they don't use chemicals, but then organic can use loads of ploughing. So it's not perfect. Outdoor reared, outdoor bred, again, better than those intensively farmed animals. Pasture fed, there's a label called 100% pasture fed, which is really important to look for as well. Thankfully, our farmers here aren't as bad as some sort of feedlot systems over in America, but we have increasingly got those feedlot systems popping up in the UK. And a lot of the data that you see about eating beef comes from the worst case scenario. Over here, because most of our beef, for example, is pasture fed, at least most of the year, it's not as bad as some of the data that you look at. And actually, animals are a part of can be a good part of the solution because of their wee and their poo and their saliva. So but the problem is that obviously finding the best can be quite a trek. You have to, personally have to go to so many different places to buy the food that I know is best for my family and the environment, which isn't going to work long term if I'm having to sort of drive around to get it. You know, it's no good for the environment. So I've got this kind of vision about every town having this beautiful supermarket. You know, if our supermarkets can't sort this problem out, then we have to create better food hub type things, where these food hubs can also be a center for learning on composting, where you can learn about waste management, where a climate action group can meet. You know, food brings people together, but we've got to have the best food we can being produced. So there's a massive upskilling required from farmers, and agronomists too need to really change their tract and learn more about the biology rather than the chemistry and throwing chemicals at problems. So yeah, it's a tricky one, Mark, I'm afraid.
It is, but I love that answer. And the work that Arthur and the People's Supermarket have done over the last years, after the last decade, kind of closes that gap. But Shula, this wants me to bring you in, because I'm looking at FareShare and thinking, you distribute food, right? You know where it's produced, you know where it's surplus, and you know who needs it. Is there a role for you? Is there another business model within FareShare, which is about serving people who aren't necessarily in need, are able to pay for it, which would then fund other work that you do, but cutting out the huge retail hikes?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it's quite outside of what we do and where we see ourselves going in the future as well. But what I would like to highlight is, with all of our regional centres across the UK, many of those are independent charities with their own environmental or social aims attached to them. So a really good example of that is the one in Yorkshire. FareShare Yorkshire now has a fully working kind of commercial kitchen called the Fulcrum Kitchen. And he takes a lot of the surplus and he creates meals, and they do lessons, and they teach the local community on how to use, you know, what might be, you know, people might look in a supermarket and go, oh no, he's really demonstrating to people how they can cook that food. A good example is, I recently took receipt of some Seville marmalade oranges. You know, they're not hand eating oranges, but we could send them to FareShare Yorkshire and he could use them for good and make marmalade. I think turning FareShare into a kind of more profit-making business in order to support other groups, it's a really fab idea. I'll email my CEO and see what he says, Mark.
If you want a hand, I'm up. I'm game for that. That's brilliant. And, you know, there's a whole opportunity here to reimagine the way that food is marked up. We know how profits work. We know how this sort of stuff works. And I think there's a real opportunity to bring the producer closer to the consumer with organizations like yourselves, potentially organizations like yourselves in the middle. But David, I'm going to come back to you now, because I'm really interested in what we were talking about in terms of waste food collection. And how many, I know 2023 is going to change everything, but right now, how many local authorities offer food waste collections? And then what percentage of people within those local authorities take it up?
Okay, well, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have got mandatory food waste collections for some time now. The data from Scotland, which I saw recently, shows that 14% of food waste is actually intercepted. So 86% is still going to incineration or landfill. So very, very low take up indeed. Wales, much better. And because they have a different system and a standardized system in Wales. In the UK, almost half, in England, almost half the councils offer food waste collection. But I think the estimate is that households produce around about 6 million, 7 million tonnes of food waste, Mark. 5 million tonnes of that is still going to landfill and incineration. So the take-up is very, very low. If you consider in Italy, where they've been doing it for 20 years, the take-up is around 110 kilos per inhabitant. The take-up in the UK is around about 10 to 20. So we're miles and miles away from the best performing systems. Of course, post-2023, hopefully that will all change. Some of the things you said before, let me recommend to you and to your viewers to read this. I've written a book, but this is not my book. I'm not plugging my book. This is a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma by an American writer called Michael Pollan, who goes through the food chain in America, following a calf that he buys and following it through the food chain, right the way through to the hamburger that he eats at a McDonald's. And it really points out some of the huge contradictions and the concentration of power which there is in the food chain. We have it here in the retail industry. 95% of our food is sold through 9 companies. America has it in the production industry, where somewhere in the region of 60-70% of all food production is controlled by very few companies. So this massive monopolization and concentration of power changes the way in which we have eaten over the last decades.
Entirely. It's almost unrecognizable. And another good book to read, if anyone's interested, is Dan Barber's The Third Plate. Dan was inspired by Michael to write that. And if you want the quick précis for that, you can watch his program on Chef's Table. There's an episode of Chef's Table in America, and it's all about regenerative agriculture and what that means for the plate. Okay, so I've got a couple of final questions, but one for you, Mark. Some of this work that I've been doing on tracking animals into slaughterhouses indicates that up to 49% of animals that reach the slaughterhouse are out of spec, too heavy, too light, had too much antibiotic, not had enough antibiotic. I know this isn't an area that you deal in at the moment, but can you see the use of data being accelerated in livestock agriculture? And can you see Envision moving into that space?
So I can see the potential for it for sure. It's, as I said sort of earlier, it's all sort of very closely related, and the amount of money and energy that is wasted providing food that isn't required, or providing the incorrect sort of treatments for livestock and the transport of that cattle, and so on and so forth. Must be immense, and I could see it being a sort of next wave. I think the wave of precision agriculture, whilst the case we were doing around long range forecasting hasn't been solved, the case around precision agriculture has been successful, and I could see that transferring into livestock, as an adjacent market. Whether it's something we would get involved in, I think I'd be happy to explore it, particularly in the UK. And perhaps it's one of those areas, again, that innovation funding can start to drive some real action for, and some real sort of joined up thinking. Because the one thing about data and platforms, that we've learned from social networking, that we're learning from other things, is that they break down silos and create new business opportunities. So the heart of what we do is, essentially cost reduction, energy, efficiency improvement, but new business models and new products and services. So I can see that coming. You're on mute, Mark.
There you go. Better for the animal, better for the waste. Look, I'm just going to bring it to a close now, because we've got 1 minute before the next session, and I heartily recommend that you join the next session, which starts at 12:35. I can't thank you enough, all of you. Absolutely incredible. What an embarrassment of talent. You've added a load to the session this morning. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.